Hello and welcome. This is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I'm going to be taking a look at an Albion Next Generation Decurio Spatha. Let me get my standard disclaimer out of the way first. I'm a novice when it comes to using swords. I have a tiny bit of training, but not enough to make any real difference. In addition, this review will be about this specific Spatha. While I own several Albion Next Generation swords, I'll try not to let my thoughts on those influence this review. One additional disclaimer. This is not my sword. When I was at Combat Con recently, a friend asked me to be his proxy and buy it for him. When I returned home, he offered to let me review it before he picked it up. So let me offer a huge thank you to Steve for this opportunity. First, let's talk about Albion. They are widely considered the top end of production swords available today. If you're not particularly familiar with the market, you might not know exactly what that means. Basically, production swords are when a company has a list of models they produce. These swords ideally are all extremely close in specifications, and the vast majority of the functional blades available today are production. Some of them are handmade from the start, hammered on anvil to shape, and some are sourced from sword blanks and then ground to shape. Now, there's no inherent benefit to forging a sword to shape versus grinding it, although a lot of people feel like forging is more authentic. Personally, the production method doesn't particularly matter to me. I care about the end result much more than the specifics of how a sword was made. Albion does their sword making via stock removal, grinding the blades to shape. One of the reasons they're popularly considered the best production swords around is the attention to detail and accuracy at meeting the specs of their models. They also put a ton of research into their swords, either producing nearly exact replicas of actual historical pieces, that's their museum line, or designing their own swords that are heavily based on antiques, the next generation line. The Decurio is part of the latter category. Now, I don't know too much about the Spatha. From the little research I've done, please remember I'm not a historian, it seems like it started as a cavalry weapon sometime in the 1st century. Towards the end of the 3rd century, I believe it started replacing the gladius in the front ranks of Roman infantry formations, giving the soldiers longer reach. I've seen some indication that these infantry Spatha had a more acute point than the more spatulated tip of the cavalry version, but I'm not particularly confident in that description. It does make sense to me though, and I'll talk about it some more later. In any case, the Spatha was in use from the 1st century into the 6th, and what we commonly refer to as migration-era swords and later Viking swords are pretty much a direct descendant, generally featuring more distal taper and wider fullers. Speaking of fullers, a Spatha can have none, or anywhere up to 4, possibly even more, and sometimes a different number of fullers on each side. They could have a lenticular, diamond, or even hexagonal cross-section. The Albion Decurio sports a lenticular cross-section with dual fullers on each side that run nearly the entire length of the blade. According to the Decurio's listing, it is a representation of a specific type of Spatha. I'll put the type name on the screen, because I know I would completely butcher the pronunciation otherwise. A new Decurio costs $880 from Albion. Normally you'd have to wait for their backlog, which I believe is around a year, but if you can make it to one of their in-person events, they have a very impressive array of swords ready to buy. Check out my Combat Con report video, linked here and in the description, for an overview of what they had at Combat Con 2021. As with all Albions, the price of the sword does not include a scabbard. At the end of this review, I'll state whether or not I think this sword is worth the price. So let's take a look at the hilt. According to Albion, there are no surviving hilts on any Spatha of this type, so they chose to produce one based on the famous Cone Spatha. I'm sorry for the pronunciation there. That Spatha itself is lost to us without any photographs. The Decurio's hilt is made of 3 separate pieces of English walnut wood, and the wood is sealed with linseed oil. The pommel is peen to the tang, and there's what Albion describes as a rivet washer separating the peen from the wood. The peen itself is nicely rounded and shows no hammer marks, although it does sit slightly above the washer. Both the washer and the peen have a little discoloration. It doesn't look like actual pitting to me, and I think it could be cleaned up with little effort. The washer sits perfectly flush against the wood on one side, but on the other side there's a bit of a gap, one big enough I can just fit a fingernail in there, and with a close-up you can actually see right through this gap. I don't think I would have noticed this without taking close-up pictures of the sword, but the gap is there, and in my opinion, it's a little disappointing. The pommel itself is an attractively shaped piece of wood that has a lot of dimension to it. It tapers in multiple directions, and everything is smoothly shaped and comfortable. The grip has 4 finger swells that really help lock my hand in place. They're well formed and comfortable to hold. Being uninformed about using a Spatha, I wasn't sure the exact grip to use. A hammer grip, like this, seemed the most intuitive, and it feels okay, but I actually found the most comfortable grip to be with my thumb resting on the guard, like this. I have no idea if this is how they were used historically, just that it felt best for dry handling, which is all I can do until my elbow heals. The guard is a relatively simple shape that complements the pommel. Also, like the pommel, it has more depth to it than a first cursory look would indicate, leading to an attractive overall shape. A bronze plate sits recessed within the guard, and the gap between it and the blade is noticeable, but it's not large. Overall, the hilt is very comfortable to use and quite attractive. I really like the dark coloration and the way Albion has brought out the grain of the walnut. Alright, time to talk about the business end, the blade. Here's the measurements I took of the sword. It features fairly minor amounts of distal taper, leading to a point of balance at 7 inches, about 18 centimeters, out from the guard. This creates a sword that feels fairly forward heavy, which brings me back to the idea of a cavalry sword. Cavalry swords generally have longer blades that have a point of balance further out, which helps add power while on horseback. That, combined with the spatulated tip, makes me wonder if that description I mentioned earlier is correct, and that this type of Spatha was designed to be a cavalry sword. In any case, even with a point of balance at 7 inches, the sword only weighs 1 pound 13 ounces, 820 grams, and that generally keeps it from feeling unwieldy. The dual fullers are straight and very cleanly ground, terminating in a gradual manner. They aren't perfectly symmetrical. They terminate at slightly different spots, both comparing the 2 fullers on one side and comparing them overall to the fullers on the other side. These are incredibly minor differences I'm pointing out here, however. The finish on the blade is the standard Albion satin, although this one has more discolorations than I'm used to on Albions. They don't look like active rust or anything like that, but like the peen and rivet washer, it's a little disappointing to see on a sword that costs nearly $900. Let's talk about the blade geometry and edge beveling. The bevel travels smoothly from the fullers to the edge before curving a little more aggressively to form the actual cutting edge. This ends up forming an Appleseed geometry that should provide good durability, and it's an effective design. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not able to do any of my normal cutting, so the best I could do was some basic printer paper. Let me set my expectations here. Swords aren't designed to cut paper, and they don't necessarily need to be sharp enough to do it well. Cleanly slicing paper is actually harder to achieve than you might think, requiring an edge to be very sharp, potentially too sharp for a sword that is expected to maintain a strong edge. That said, I do expect a sword to be able to cut into the paper, even if it does do some tearing. I was surprised that the Decurio struggled to cut paper more than I expected. This footage is the second time I tried cutting paper with it, and it was more successful than the first. Still, much of the time I wasn't able to get a cut started, and even when I did, it did more tearing than I would have liked. That makes the edge a little disappointing to me. It could really use to be touched up a bit to bring it in line to where I think it should be. The overall geometry should lend itself to very effective cutting though, and I don't think it would take much work to get this nicely sharpened. So now it's time to talk bottom line. Is this sword worth the $880 price tag? First, let me reiterate that this is my opinion only. Yours could very well be different, and that's okay. That being said, I have some mixed feelings here. On the one hand, the fit and finish on the Decurio is a little bit less than I would expect from an Albion. The small gap between the rivet washer and the pommel, the bits of discoloration on the blade, and the less than ideal edge are minor flaws, but they do add up. On the other hand, there's something about this sword that feels really, really good in the hand. It's hard to explain really, especially because I generally don't favor one-handed swords that have a point of balance so far out. But when holding the sword and moving it around, it just feels right. My opinion is complicated by the fact that I didn't pay for this sword. If I had dropped $880 of my own dollars, it would be easier for me to know how I felt about it. So I'm basing my opinion on this. After handling the sword, taking pictures and video, and collecting my thoughts, I'm seriously thinking of getting an Albion Spatha of my own. It might be the Decurio, or it might be the Auxilia, or another model if Albion releases one. So since this sword has enticed me enough to want one of my own, I guess it pretty much by default means that I think it's worth the price. But that's just my opinion. What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you happen to enjoy this review, please hit the like button, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel. Until next time, Alien 2'd out.